I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome. Last week, healthcare workers walked off the job in a wildcat strike.
Stand up to Kenney! Stand up to Kenney!
It was quickly declared illegal. The strike followed government plans to cut 11,000 jobs in laundry, labs, and other services, mostly through outsourcing.
Now, labor costs make up roughly 70% of AHS's total expenses. AHS can't achieve savings, and those savings can't be then reinvested into improving the system.
The opposition NDP says the government is trying to create chaos in healthcare.
Today, thousands of healthcare workers walked off their jobs because of the chaos and disrespect of this government. More than 25 hospitals impacted so far in a pandemic. These frontline workers have been working double shifts, putting their lives and the lives of their families on the line for Albertans. Instead of thank you, this government threatens to fire 11,000 of them, calls them overpaid, and says the work they do does not matter.
The government says that the cuts are necessary to constrain costs, and they're quick to point out how cozy the NDP is with unions.
We as a government will continue to fight for patients and fight for increasing access for patients in this province, and we'll fight just as hard as the NTB fights for the six-figure salaries of their union bosses.
Tussling with unions and public sector workers has been a feature of the government since Jason Kenney was elected premier. The second bill the UCP introduced brought back secret ballots for union votes. Shortly after, the government tried to postpone union negotiations, leading to court challenges and protests. Then, in the two budgets before the pandemic, the government laid out plans to cut public sector workers by 7.7%.
We're broke, and we have to make tough choices. And my response to anybody who asks that is, where else would you want us to find the savings?
My guests today are Joel French, Executive Director of Public Interest Alberta, and Franco Terrazzano, who's the Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Thanks very much for joining me, guys.
Good to be here.
And thank you so much for having me on.
The UCP government has been courting controversy of late among public sector workers. Most recently came the announcement that about 11,000 jobs at Alberta Health Services would be lost due to outsourcing. We're talking about jobs in services like laundry and food preparation. And this was followed not long after by a wildcat strike at numerous Alberta hospitals. Joel, as someone who advocates for Alberta Public Services, were you surprised by the reaction that these outsourcing announcements caused?
Not surprised, no. I think anger has been building for quite a while among public sector workers, but I think among Albertans in general. And I don't even limit it to the current government. I think it's been for years, if not decades, that successive governments have moved towards privatizing public services, making them less transparent, less accountable, giving the workers lower wages, fewer benefits, and really, I mean, the only folks that win are the folks that own the corporations that get these contracts. Those are the people who are making a lot of money off of these things. Some of them are wealthy Albertans. Some of them are wealthy folks from around the world that own shares in these big corporations that are getting the big contracts. And the only way that they make money is spending less in Alberta. And it's unfortunate to see things continuing to go that direction. So I think folks are frustrated, union members and non-union members alike.
On the flip side, though, Franco, we talk about a government, successive governments in Alberta who've kind of spent beyond their means, as it were. They've spent beyond what their revenue projections are and what they're bringing in. Do you feel like outsourcing is the right way to go in these areas?
Well, we've certainly seen governments spend beyond taxpayers' means. And just for that announcement, giving local businesses the opportunity to provide services like coffee, the cafeterias, or to do the laundry, that to me is a common sense approach. Now, there is a ton of frustration in Alberta, and I think rightfully so. I mean, for many years, we've seen Albertans working outside of government struggle with pay cuts and job losses. And unfortunately, when we needed relief the most, we've seen the struggling taxpayers have to pay even more to cover growing government labor costs, which have increased by billions of dollars since the downturn began 5 years ago. And now we're left looking at a $100 billion debt tab. And I think the question that we all have to ask is, well, how are we going to pay for this? And I really don't think that we can go to the struggling families who are having a very difficult time putting groceries on the table, or go to businesses who have already had to lay off their staff or have already had to hand out pay cuts and ask them to pay even more money so that government labor costs continue to increase. And right now we're looking at our labor costs making up more than half of day-to-day government spending. So there really is no way for this government to be able to balance the books and to pay down the debt unless government employees are willing to share in the tough times and take a pay cut.
But I mean, on that note, Franco, I get that the CTF advocates for kind of shrinking government spending or government spending within their means, but what do you make of the timing of this move in the middle of a pandemic? Yes, as you say, other Albertans in the private sector have been hurting, but how does it help Alberta get through kind of this tough time if it just kind of increases to the number of people who are hurting because of the pandemic?
Well, I mean, Dave, there really is no good time to talk about pay cuts. It's always a very difficult conversation. And of course, Albertans, we really appreciate all the work that our healthcare workers are doing here. But at the end of the day, we do have this question of how are we going to pay for this $100 billion debt problem? And we've already seen so many Albertans outside of government take pay cuts, take job losses. And it would be extremely unfair to ask them to do all of the heavy lifting. And really, it has been struggling taxpayers working outside of government who have been doing all the heavy lifting for the last 5 years. And I mean, the only way that we're really going to be able to balance the budget, if the government isn't willing to reduce government labor costs, is to increase taxes. And I really don't think it'd be fair to be going to the struggling families, the struggling businesses who have been struggling for so long and ask them to pay even more money to fund what is a bloated provincial government.
Now, Joel, what do you make of that assertion? Like the idea that the government has $100 billion in debt that it's sitting on and has to deal with at some point, and the idea that during a pandemic, when people are losing their jobs or people may have had to take pay cuts in the private sector, and even public sector workers may have been laid off or had to take pay cuts as well, that something like a tax increase wouldn't go over very well right now with a lot of Albertans.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. First, I mean, I would take issue with the idea that it's only been folks in the private sector that have been hurting the past few years and that have been putting in effort. I mean, especially our healthcare workers. I feel like to say that now, even though, sure, we value them more in the pandemic, but I think most Albertans value the work that healthcare workers, that people in the education system are doing at any time. So I don't think there's ever a right time to attack them. Certainly right now is not a good time to attack them. But when we talk about the debt and deficit, I don't think for most Albertans that is the top priority right now. It is a problem, and it is something at some point that we do need to address. So I can come to some kind of middle ground on that. The reality that none of our politicians and a lot of folks, none of our politicians want to talk about, and a lot of folks don't know about, is how anemic our tax system is compared to those of the rest of the country. And, we can talk about what the right mix of taxes is, but I mean, one thing that should be front of mind for folks is the huge tax cut that large corporations got. And again, some of those are large Alberta corporations, but a lot of those are large multinational corporations, and they're taking those profits out of this province at a time where we need investment in the province, and it doesn't make any sense at all. So when we talk about being short revenue and needing to cover debt, the most obvious thing is something that the Kenney government did to us, and that is forego billions of dollars of corporate tax revenue so that his wealthy friends could make a little more profit.
Well, and I was going to get to this in a little bit, but seeing as you raised it, I may as well jump on this now. The tax cut was seen as kind of one of the key planks of Alberta's economic recovery plan, hoping to stimulate the economy. Franco, how would you categorize the UCP's economic plan to get us back on track? Is the government doing the right things in your mind to stimulate job growth and economic recovery? And does the tax cut fit in with that?
Well, it's been a bit of a mixed bag from the United Conservatives. On the one hand, we see them doling out corporate welfare. For example, the petrochemical subsidies that were announced last week. I mean, that is a wrong turn. We do see the business tax cut as a good move. I mean, you're not going to help the economy grow by taking more money from businesses. And when we're talking about tax revenue, I mean, how much tax revenue are you going to collect from a business that leaves Alberta or that doesn't come to Alberta, right? I mean, there's only so much blood that you can draw from a stone. Now, when we hear people talk about a revenue problem, I mean, what we're really hearing is a suggestion of higher taxes, and of course, higher taxes on struggling families and struggling businesses must be a non-starter. And if we look at the revenue problem, have we seen revenue from the COVID-19 downturn, from the economic shutdown, from the oil price collapse impact revenue? Absolutely. But does the Alberta government have a structural revenue problem? Well, absolutely not. So if we look at the pre-COVID downturn between 2015 and 2018, on average, the Alberta government brought in more revenue per person than British Columbia did. And if we look before the downturn, so if we look the years 2014 and prior, it really was no contest. The Alberta government brought in significantly more revenue per person than our neighbors in British Columbia. What we do see, and what we've seen across party lines, is a spending problem. We have a $10 billion spending problem right now, and really that stems from the last decade of the progressive Conservatives that doubled program spending. We saw the NDP come to power, and they continued to hike spending. And we even saw the United Conservatives, even before COVID-19, they continued to increase spending.
Joel, before we move on, did you want to respond to some of Franco's assertions about the government and their spending habits?
Yeah, I mean, I thought at the beginning of Franco's comments there that he was conceding that there was some kind of revenue problem, but then towards the end, it didn't feel like maybe that's the case. But it's so obvious when you look at the numbers that the government every year, no matter what party is in power, publishes a graph in their budget documents that shows if we had the same tax system as any other province in the country, how much more revenue we would raise per year. The smallest number on that graph is over $14 billion. So we could have any tax system in the country other than our own, and we would raise at least $14 billion more per year in revenue. That's more than the deficit has been any year other than, of course, this year with the COVID pandemic, where we've had a lot of extra spending. But outside of this year, it's very obvious what the solution is. And I mean, you can still push for cuts in some areas. I get that some groups, especially corporate lobby groups, are going to do that. But, you can't honestly say that our tax system in any way compares to the ability of other tax systems in the country to generate revenue. That's just not true.
Mm-hmm. Now, over the last several months, we've seen a number of moves by the UCP that relate to either public sector unions, like the announcement at AHS and the outsourcing of the 11,000 jobs. We've seen back and forth between the government and the Alberta Medical Association, and there are concerns that the government doesn't necessarily have, I guess, the interests of public sector workers at heart. Joel, do you feel that the government is trying to legislate the strength of unions out of Alberta?
I mean, yeah, I do, but I don't know that that's the point for most Albertans. I think the attacks on public sector workers, like our healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, in the education system, laying off teachers and thousands of support staff prior to the pandemic, those things affect everybody in the province that accesses those public services. So any family that has a child in school, especially if they have higher needs, those are the people that the layoffs of support staffs and teachers are affecting the most. When we have attacks on doctors and doctors leave our province, which has been disproportionately in rural areas, it's folks that live in those rural towns that feel it the most. So yeah, I do think they're deliberately attacking public sector workers. But what it ends up being is an attack on everybody. And I think that's why there's so much anger in this province right now about those cuts.
And Franco, from your perspective, do you feel that in some of these cases that there just seems to be resistance on the part of these groups to, as you said earlier, kind of share the pain, as it were, or is that an unfair thing to ask of them right now?
Well, I do see most of the anger coming from these union bosses. And I mean, look, Albertans who voted, they gave the United Conservatives an overwhelming mandate to balance the books without raising taxes. I mean, Albertans, we've been struggling for many years, right? Many Albertans outside of government struggling with pay cuts, struggling with job losses. And we haven't seen the last broad Alberta government pay cut since 1994. And it was a 5% pay cut back in 94. And we've seen massive amounts of pay cuts, many higher than that over the last 5 years. And here's the crux of the fundamental unfairness that we're talking about today with labor. Since the downturn began at the end of 2014, we've seen total compensation pay to all Alberta workers declined by about 5%. During that same time, we've seen government labor costs increase by about $3.5 billion or 15%. It's just no longer fair to be going to struggling families, struggling businesses, and ask them to pay a little bit more so that government employees can get a pay increase, right? We need to see the opposite. We need to see union bosses come to the table and be willing to accept pay reductions. And I do think there are probably many government employees who realize that they're very lucky to have a job and who would be willing to perhaps accept a pay cut so that they would even be able to hold on to their job and also help share in the burden.
Now, obviously, we're in the middle of kind of tough times. Tensions have been high all year. You've been dealing with a pandemic, economic slowdown, businesses shut down, and then the government has been kind of embroiled in disputes with various groups within the public sector. How long do either of you feel that this could kind of go on before we see people get a breaking point? There was a wildcat strike that followed the AHS announcement. Joel, from your perspective, could a budget that is a bad news budget kind of push certain groups kind of past the breaking point?
I don't know. That's a tough call. I mean, I like to think that people are going to speak up more loudly than they have. I think a lot of people are hurting, but a lot of people are feeling beaten down as well. And I think sometimes it can be difficult to fully engage when that's the case. I think that people do need to band together more as communities. That can be a difficult thing to do in a time like this, but I do think that there is some sort of new, different kind of community building through this COVID pandemic where we realize, we do need to be in this together. So, I mean, I'm hoping that that kind of spirit translates into the way that we treat our politics and our government and our democratic institutions, where people do engage more and feel like they can do something about this government that is continually beating them down.
Franco, looking ahead to 2021, there will be a budget in February or March. What conversation do you feel the government needs to have with Albertans to kind of sell what you feel may need to be done to get us over this hump?
Well, I think what we're really going to need to see is even more leadership from the top. Now we've started to see the UCP and all Alberta legislatures willing to share in a bit of the tough times. Right? We saw the Premier take a 10% cut. We saw all MLAs take a 5% cut. We just heard about political staffers also taking a cut. Now that's not the end of the story. There's still more to be done. And when I talk about leadership at the top, what we'd like to see is something similar to what happened in New Zealand, where not only did the politicians take a pay cut, but the top bureaucrats also took a 20% pay cut. And that's something that I think we need to see within our government departments. For example, in Alberta, our top bureaucrats make about a 30% compensation premium compared to the Ontario West average. Now, we've heard a lot of different discussions, especially with healthcare because of what's been going on late. But one discussion that we really need to talk about is the bureaucracy costs within healthcare. So we found more than 900 management bureaucrats on the AHS Sunshine List. Our president and CEO of AHS, she's taking home close to about $700,000 per year, which is more than $200,000 more than her counterparts in Saskatchewan. So we haven't seen enough leadership at the top, particularly when we're talking about the top bureaucrats in departments or in these types of government agencies. And I think that's going to have to be key for the Kenney government to be able to do what is necessary and really deliver pay cuts across the board for government employees.
Joel, what do you make of that? Do you think that that's showing leadership among kind of top-ranking bureaucrats, or just window dressing as an excuse to make cuts elsewhere?
It kind of blows my mind that anybody is talking about wanting to make pay cuts across the board to Albertans. And I know Franco's talking specifically about public sector, obviously, but people are hurting so much right now, and to beat them when they're already down it does blow my mind. I think the discussions about how much politicians get paid and top bureaucrats, they can be a little bit interesting to me. Ultimately, I think they end up being a political gimmick. I mean that in the sense that in the grand scheme of the budget, they don't represent a big amount. I'm not opposed to somebody talking about that, but if we could talk about the bigger issues, wealth inequality for me is a big one where, the people that actually deserve a pay cut are those making millions, if not billions per year. And, those folks aren't in the public sector. Those folks that are doing the best are in the private sector, and they're getting more and more handouts all of the time. They're getting more corporate subsidies. Those are the folks that can actually afford to pay more. And those are the people who need to be making the biggest sacrifices, is those who have the most. And they are in the private sector.
I think we'll leave it there for now. Joel French, Franco Terrazzano, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Dave, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, appreciate it.
That's it for Under the Dome. Thanks for watching. You can find all the episodes at the Edmonton Journal's YouTube page or at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.